Hey guys, welcome back to Not Another SEO Guru. So today we're going to talk about what is schema markup? Why should I care? Why should you care? Why should your clients care? Well, in most cases, your clients don't. But if they did, there's a very specific reason why we use schema. And essentially, what it is code that is invisible to the user. It's something that goes onto the website in the background, just like all of the other code that makes up the web page. But it essentially speaks to Google and helps to organize the data for them to understand specific things about the brand or the entity, as we like to refer to that, and really curate all of the different points of data that we want Google to pay attention to and make the correct conclusions from about our entity. So essentially, who you are, what you do, where you do it, why, how long, who's associated with the business, what types of products and services do you offer, where do you offer them, and then all of the other peripheral data, such as the principles in terms of who owns and runs the company, who's involved in operations, if that data is available, uh, and other points of data such as customer reviews and things like that. But essentially, schema is, as I've taught in the past, a focusing mechanism whereby you bring in the points of data that Google may or may not understand about your brand, and you organize them in such a way that the algorithm will then make a more favorable determination about your brand. So the end result is if you do this correctly, you will show up better in search results. You'll also show up more frequently in search results in different ways. So one of those ways is obviously in regular organic search, but with enhancements. So we call those rich snippets or featured snippets. Um, Sometimes we call that position zero or a knowledge panel, things like that. When we went over this in the entity mastery group, and previous to that with the entity establishment course that Jimmy, Russ, and I pioneered back in the day, we taught something called entity establishment. And schema plays a very big part of that, where as I've mentioned before, the goal of entity optimization is to present and control the target data. And the target meaning you, the client, person, place, thing, whatever that target might be, which is presented to Google to allow Google or the AI to digest and determine the outcome we wish to achieve with as little variance in the probabilities of choice as possible. There's so many different ways that Google can determine what we're about and what this entity means. And if you get that association wrong, you can introduce what we call things like entity pollution. You can be associated with the wrong things. And that affects your ability to show up correctly, to rank as well as you should be. You ideally want your brand to be synonymous with the queries that you want to be found for, and you also want to be the authoritative choice for that query. And one of the ways to facilitate this is through schema markup. And that allows the AI algorithm to make the determinations correctly, and we lower the variance. So we provide those pathways to make a more positive determination about our brand. And that allows you to achieve a massive advantage. And if you do this correctly, this is where you have people saying, no, schema doesn't work. But I'm here to tell you it works very, very well if you do it correctly. There's so many different ways to not do it correctly. One of those ways, which I'll be sharing in a separate video, the 4 key mistakes that you do not want to make when you're implementing schema markup. One of those is relying on plugins. Plugins often get that implementation very wrong, or they introduce other forms of schema that introduce variance. So we'll be going over that in more detail in a separate video. But remember, this goes far beyond simply claiming a Google business profile, implementing basic local business schema, using plugins, that kind of thing on a target site. We now must understand the relationships of each component that make up the target entity or the brand as a whole, and then seek to control them. Ideally, only then do we proceed to reveal our entity to Google. So if you do this work very early on, say if it's a new website or if it's a new brand, and you do this correctly, and then you have your reveal, as I've called it in the past, to Google, if you do that right, then Google will make more favorable determinations about the brand. You'll lower the time frame that it takes to actually rank correctly, and you'll have other benefits that come from that. When I talk about this concept, there are many different facets of this type of data collation and focus. One of them is in this diagram where you have a lot of different areas of influence that the brand or the person behind the brand can touch and be associated with. So one of them is your own personal brand. What Google determines is you. This is, social media contributions, entities of association, um, organizations, or different uh, groups and things that you belong to and contribute to, published works, guest posts, white papers, press release, forums, areas of expertise that make up that understanding of the person behind the brand. And then as you translate to the brand itself, there's quality sources of information that it belongs to or contributes to, things like maps and Chamber of Commerce and different organizations published, like if the company is maybe sponsors authored content and things like that, curated sources of information. So this is where some of the external properties come into play as you build out the brand. So citations is one example of that. And then trusted established seed entities. So we call these hub properties, and we'll go into much more detail about that in other videos. But essentially what we do with all of this is you can think of these things as lenses. And right now, when we're looking at these lenses per se, there's a very small zone in the middle where they all overlap, and that's what we call the confluence. And the goal is to focus each one of these lenses in such a way that that center confluence expands. So essentially what the confluence is, it's the synergy of data. It's presenting clarity of understanding to Google. So they understand very, very clearly what the brand is about, what they are purporting to do, and they have the evidence to support that. So Google makes that connection. So essentially what happens if you do that correctly, and Schema is a facilitator of this, is your entity, your brand becomes synonymous with the target keyword. And that is a function of how well you focus that data. And how well you do that with those data points determines how strong of a confluence occurs and how quickly you solidify those key data associations. So if you do that correctly, you'll see a good example of this when you do a search in a local market. And essentially, you might see a result where you see a maps pack. You'll see competitors listed in the map, but often you'll do another type of search and you'll just see one. There'll be no maps pack. There'll just be a great big result in one brand showing. And that's an example of a synergy of data occurring. It generates a knowledge panel. So we'll be going much deeper into these topics, and I do hope you join us for more. But uh, essentially, that is what schema markup is, and it's also what it can do for you when done correctly. Thank you. We'll talk to you soon. Please subscribe.